Hi, this is Ms. Hadi from Olympian High School. We're going to be studying the Global Depression, the Great Depression, using the Traditions and Encounters textbook, and we'll also be using the publisher-produced PowerPoint slides. So the first thing you need to understand is when they say the Great Depression, they don't mean awesome depression, they mean large. The word here, great, means large. So we need to set the stage for what was happening that is going to cause so many economies to suffer. It's going to be a widespread depression that is going to become global. So we'll start by setting the scene with what it was like prior to the Great Depression. And the PowerPoint slides will be very helpful here. So after World War I, Austria and Germany were forced to pay reparations for the war. And they were supposed to pay these reparations to France and England, but they couldn't afford it, so they borrowed money from the United States. France and England had also borrowed money from the United States because they needed to pay for supplies during World War I. And so the interesting part about this is that both the people that had lost, or the countries that had lost the war, and the countries that had won the war were sort of dependent on the United States. And if something happened to the United States economy, that's going to have repercussions on the entire global system. The entire system is dependent on the flow of cash from the United States. And the United States is going to experience a problem starting in 1928. So we're going to look at this as being part of the reason for why the Great Depression starts, but it's not the only reason. There were other issues that are going to lead to the Great Depression. But first, just understanding that if something happens in the United States, it could become a global problem. One of the things that is described in your book are new technologies that reduce the demand for raw materials. So for example, if you don't need as much raw rubber if you're able to reclaim rubber. So you end up having way more rubber than you need. And so that's going to lead to a decreased demand on rubber. We see this happening in other kinds of industries, like it tells you about the synthetics industry hurting the cotton industry, the increased use of oil weakening or undermining the coal industry, the adoption of artificial nitrogen weakening demand for nitrates. So what this is going to do is any countries that have to that depend on the export of raw materials like rubber, like oil, like cotton, they're going to see their economies weaken. And it tells you about the destruction of economies based on rubber, but there were lots of other economies that were dependent on raw materials that are going to suffer. Then you have another problem with agricultural surpluses, and this is described in this paragraph. And this is a result of overproduction in the 1920s. When people went to war, basically, when soldiers were off at war, other countries started to expand their production to meet the demand. They expanded their production. But at the end of the war, those farmers went back and they were farming again, and that led to a surplus of food. So when you have basics of economics is you have too much supply, the price is going to fall. So you have way more countries than before farming, and you have all these farmers returning home from the war, and then you have strong harvests in the years 1925 to 1929. This is going to cause the price of all goods to fall, all farm-produced goods, and wheat reaches its lowest level in 400 years. And that's going to lead to all kinds of problems because there will be effects on what these farmers can spend. They're not going to be able to have as much money to pay for manufactured goods. The demand for manufactured goods will increase and inventory surpluses will increase. This also talks about the Dust Bowl in the mid to late 1930s. This was a problem where the topsoil in America was basically eroded, and many people in like Arkansas and Oklahoma ended up migrating because they weren't able to produce as much food on their lands. I'm not sure where it's referenced in your book, but it is something you should be aware of, and it will also be explained in your prep books. Okay, so that's what the Dust Bowl reference is about. So another problem for farmers. Okay, so this leads us to the crash of 1929, which is what we call when the Great Depression, technically started. Remember, it wasn't the only reason, but this is when the Great Depression is traditionally thought of as sort of starting with this stock market crash. Many people in the United States had been buying what we call speculative ventures that are not certain. There's, for example, they're able to make these purchases which are speculative because they don't have to pull down the full price of the stock. They only have to put 3% of the stock's price in cash, and they could borrow the rest from others. Well, in 1929, there were hints of an economic slowdown. This is going to cause investors to pull their money out of the stock market and lead to a wave of panic selling on Black Thursday, 24th of October. When people start selling, this has a snowball effect, and other people also start selling, which causes the price, because there's an oversupply now, it causes the price of those stocks to fall, and many people lost their entire life savings. So it tells you from little old ladies to industrial tycoons, many people lost their entire life savings overnight. By the end of the day, 11 financiers had committed suicide. This is telling you the gravity of the situation. Okay, well, this is going to lead to an economic contraction because people don't have the money to make consumer purchases. So consumer demand is going to fall. You also see companies responding, since people aren't buying their goods, with laying off or causing basically firing people. So there's all these people that are unemployed or underemployed, which further causes demand to plummet, which further causes more unemployment. And so we see industrial production falling to half of its 1929 level. And many U.S. banks go out of business. And this wasn't like it is now, where your money was protected in the bank. So this is going to cause many people to lose their savings. And again, because of that dependency on U.S. capital, there's going to be a contraction across the world. So again, inventory surplus leads to people being fired or layoffs. Layoffs lead to decreased demand. Businesses fail. We talked about the reduction of U.S. Industrial production and banks going out of business, people losing their deposits. You're not used to that now because some of your money is insured now, FDIC insured. Okay, so we're going to see these problems really mount in the 1930s. This economic contraction is going to cause countries that depended on the sale of export of manufactured goods to suffer, especially those that basically had to sell manufactured goods to get food, like Germany and Japan will be very, very hard hit. Also, countries that are single export countries, producing things like coffee, sugar, cotton, these countries will also be very hard hit by the Great Depression. Okay, so let's talk about how U.S. investors are going to respond. And here, I'm going to tell you that the initial government response was not adequate. They tried to increase demand. So, and this is not just in the U.S., and all across the world. For example, how do you increase demand, or how much people want to buy? One way that they thought might help the economy is raising the price. Well, how do you raise the price? You lower the supply. So in Brazil, they would go so far as to burn coffee beans or use them to build highways, anything they could do to reduce the amount of supply to try to increase the price. In the USA, they had this policy called planned scarcity, where they destroyed vegetables, fruits, and animals as people were starving because of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. This is captured really beautifully and painfully in John Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath, which is talks about the basically the slums that were created during this time and how people were starving to death as the government was destroying food. So you can read about that in your book. Okay. The last thing we want to talk about here is economic nationalism. So first of all, we need to understand that laissez-faire economics, or letting the kind of economy do whatever it wants without government regulation, hadn't worked. Planned scarcity as an approach hadn't worked. And what we'll start to see and economic nationalism doesn't work either. What we'll start to see is new kinds of economic policies that become powerful for trying to end the Great Depression. But before we talk about those new policies, let's spend a moment on economic nationalism. Economic nationalism is when you basically try to protect your own companies at home, your nation's companies, your nation's economy, by imposing tariffs and quotas to try to limit the amount of purchases people are making on foreign goods. So what ends up happening is some countries will pass tariffs, basically taxes on trade goods, and other countries will retaliate. So one of the most famous tariffs was the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, which raised duties or taxes on foreign goods and was basically met with retaliation and led to a drop in international trade. And we see international trade dropping by more than 66% by 1932. Now, eventually, there's going to be an economist named John Maynard Keynes who suggests that instead of basically destroying supply, there's a way of stimulating the economy by creating more money circulation in the economy, by lowering interest rates, which would encourage investment and employment. Now, his ideas don't really become popular until after World War II, but they'll be anticipated by this president named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he introduces his New Deal. And we'll also see the US economy improve after all of the spending on weapons in World War II.